All right. Welcome to the next panel. We are today talking about CO2 pipeline safety regulations. This is an extremely emerging topic. The Pipeline Safety Trust kind of got involved after the gassing of Satartia article written by Dan Zegart. We are going to hear from him in a little bit, but in addition, the 45Q tax credit expansion as well as the Inflation Reduction Act really kind of set this off in motion, and the Pipeline Safety Trust has been working diligently to get caught up to speed on carbon dioxide pipelines, the regulations, the safety risks. After Dan's article, Pipeline Safety Trust commissioned a report from an independent pipeline safety expert to really look at the regulatory gaps and the safety issues of carbon dioxide pipelines. We're going to talk a little bit about what that report highlighted today. But let me first introduce myself. I've been introduced a little bit before, but my name's Amanda McKay. I'm the program manager for the Pipeline Safety Trust. I started in April of this year, so I think potentially out of everyone in the room, I might be the newest to pipeline safety, minus Erin, but she's downstairs. When I was doing my interview for PST, there was a section that they gave me an option of potential topics to talk through, to see if I could critically think about the issues that PST was working on, and one of the options was CO2 pipelines. And I had never heard of CO2 pipelines. I didn't know that was a thing. And so they showed the video that we're about to show in a minute here. They showed me that video, and it opened up my eyes about the extreme safety risks and the potential devastation that CO2 pipelines can have on communities, as we've seen. So that really opened my eyes, and it actually was pretty much the reason that I wanted to start working for the Pipeline Safety Trust. It's such an important topic, and it's one that seems to be on the forefront of everyone's mind right now. So I'm really happy to have all of our panelists here today to talk about this issue, and especially honored to have Dan Zegart, the author of the Gassing of Satartia article that really opened everyone's eyes to this topic. So I think that we're going to have a really great discussion here today. And first, we are going to hear from Dan about the Satartia incident. So Dan, if you'd like to come up.
Thank you.
Let's move to the next slide.
Yeah.
And so you have the advancer.
What does that do?
The green button advances.
Okay. First of all, I want to say it's a great pleasure to be here with folks who are interested in pipeline safety. I was spent a lot of time in Mississippi in 2020 in this little town of Satartia, which, if you looked for a better example of a tiny little American hamlet that's beautiful and bucolic and in a beautiful place with great people, not a lot of people, only about 50 people or so live in this little town, and about 200 or 300 around it. You couldn't find a better candidate than this town, and I have to admit, as a journalist, you can't be objective about this one. It's a beautiful place, and that's all there is to it. We're here to talk about sort of the individual impacts of the human impacts on actual people of what is being planned for us in other places in Washington, and now very, very almost frenetically among the oil and gas and other people who want to build CCS and build pipelines. And we all know there's a good reason to worry about sequestering carbon. It's a good thing to be a good thing to do. But this is what happened in this little town in February of 2020. There's about, as I said, maybe 300 people altogether involved in this, but it was a sort of an ordinary Saturday night. A lot of folks had gone off to a baby shower or an event up in nearby Yazoo City. So there weren't as many people in the town as there might have been, but this all started at about 7:06. Is when the 7:06 p.m. on this Saturday in February. Could we play the? And within a few minutes of the leak, which is when that happened, they started getting at 7:13. They started getting 911 calls. This was one of the first calls. Could we play that, please?
Happening, and then what's the location of the emergency?
I am like 5 minutes off of Highway 3, on Highway 433 from Highway 3. My friend, she's laying on the ground and she's shaking. She's kind of drooling out of the mouth. I don't know if she's having a seizure or not. We need somebody to
Okay, baby. Is this in Satarsha area?
Yes.
Okay, what kind of vehicle are you in?
I am in a blue Honda Accord. It stopped in the middle of the road.
Okay, so you are on 43 close to Highway 3, correct?
Yes.
All right, how old is she?
How old is she? 22.
Okay, is she still convulsing at this time?
Yes.
Okay, what is a good phone number for you just in case I lose connection with you?
662-590-3719.
Okay, well, just stay calm for me. I've got help coming to you.
Is there anything we should be doing right now?
I'm going to help you with that, okay? Tell me exactly what had happened.
Well, I don't know what's going on up the road, but it was like I was driving and I ran into like a lot of fumes. Like it's a lot of noise going on, and like I couldn't see anything. My car wouldn't back up. Like I don't know what's going on. And it was like strong fumes coming up. I had to cover my nose to get out of the car. I don't know if she covered hers or not. That could be one thing. And my chest is hurting really bad.
Okay.
But could you really get somebody, like, quick?
Sweetheart, I've got help. Baby, I have help coming to you right now. Are you with her right now?
Yes, it's 4 of us.
There's 4 of you? Okay, is anybody else having any chest pain or anything like that with the fumes?
Is anybody else having chest pain? Is it
Or any
chest pain?
breathing problems?
No, ma'am. Everybody else is fine.
Okay, is she awake right now?
Yes, ma'am. Her eyes is open.
Okay, and is she breathing?
Yes.
All right, sweetie. We have an ambulance that's been dispatched out. I'm just going to ask a couple of quick questions.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
This is not slowing them down at all. Has she had more than one seizure in a row?
I don't know her. She's a friend of a friend.
Okay, well, since you've been there with her, has she had more than one?
No, ma'am. I don't think so.
Okay. Okay, is she pregnant or has she been pregnant in the last 4 weeks that you're aware of?
No, ma'am.
Okay, and if you don't know any of these questions, that's perfectly fine. Do you or anyone there know if she's a diabetic?
Ma'am?
Do you or...
Okay. So thanks for listening to that, because that's a very, especially the beginning part still scares me. So this is a woman who's up on a little hill on the road that runs across this hill and then comes down into the valley where Satarsha is that's the Yazoo River. And this woman is calling. She, at the time that this happened, was probably within a few hundred yards, judging by what we learned later, of where the break actually took place. And there's a huge, as you saw, initial release. And this woman and some of those people in the car evidently were in it. Her car stalled, went dead. The engine went dead, which is what happens when you're in a cloud of carbon dioxide. It deprives it of oxygen. You can't burn fuel without oxygen. Anyway, the other thing that's illustrative about this, aside from the fact that her car died and therefore she couldn't get out, was that the ambulance actually had to go somewhere else to meet her. Because they couldn't get up on that hill either. They would have conked out. There's been a lot said about how you can deal with that problem if there is such an event again, one of the companies said they were going to buy electric, this is out in the Midwest where they're building these ethanol pipelines, they promised them electric fire trucks. But it turns out on closer inspection there's only one electric fire truck and it's in Canada. So I think that's going to be difficult. Anyway, so here you have a situation where you have folks who are stranded in their homes. They, by and large, many people could not be evacuated. They had to self-evacuate. As they drove out of town, they suffered a range of health effects. But the most immediate thing that happened was, as this plume descended, and it came down very quickly at about 7 p.m., people just went unconscious, bang, one after another. About 24 people passed out within about 3 minutes of that initial release. You know that from tracking a lot of people who were there and just figuring out where people were at what time and what happened to them. So that's the first thing. But these were sublethal exposures. So they woke up again. Later on, we'll take a quick look at this Lake Nyos incident where people did not get up again. 1,700 of them never got up again. That was a CO2 incident as well. Anyway, what this revealed was, as you could tell, the caller had no idea what she was driving through. The dispatcher also had no idea what the gas was that she was dealing with. They had not been informed by the company that there had been a leak at this point of the CO2 pipeline. And they were guessing, trying to figure out what the heck it was. And so what they were telling people was that it was natural gas. It just illustrates the level of confusion and fear that people felt when all of a sudden people are going unconscious around them, getting sick and throwing up and all sorts of things, and no one knows what it is. You have to put yourself in that position to understand why the people in that community are still afraid, and some still have trouble going to sleep at night. This was a really, when you, universally, the question that I asked was, how does this rate in your experiences? And to a person, everyone said, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. People called their spouses to say goodbye. So I'm giving you all this personal detail because this is the part that's lacking. One, what happens in the event of an actual explosive rupture. Two, what physical effects this gas can have on people. Many of which have not been studied. I interviewed a well-known emergency room doctor, a guy who actually travels from hospital to hospital in Europe and advises them on procedures. And he had written a paper on CO2. And I said, well, what got you interested in CO2? And he said, I'm not interested in CO2. Nobody's interested in CO2 because it's not a glamorous thing to study because this type of thing has been basically unheard of. People don't pass out every day walking down the street from carbon dioxide. So it's not a phenomenon that we really know much about. And the folks who went through this, who went through the worst of it, still, to this day, some of them have serious health concerns. I'm not just talking about, and I'm not trivializing them, I'm not just talking about PTSD and, emotional issues. I'm talking about continued reduction of lung capacity, continued headaches, confusion, and in the case of 3 of the people who were in a car for 4 hours breathing as completely unconscious and who were rescued, according to the fire people who rescued them, just on the brink of death. That these are folks who lived through long sublethal exposures to this gas, and there were serious consequences. The companies that want to build pipelines want to say that, and they've continued to say, there were no injuries in this incident, which is just so disrespectful to what happened and to the people it happened to. There were serious injuries. There were overnight hospitalizations, which the company, Denbury, which operated the pipeline, had insisted did not happen. There were people who were in the hospital for a week afterwards. And then these 3 gentlemen who suffered this very long period of exposure who are still sick. One of them is with us today, and he's going to be speaking on several panels Debray, would you stand up for just a minute and just let folks see you? This is Debray Burns, who survived this, who was in a car right near the explosion, within 500 feet of it. And what they heard was a roaring like a jet engine, and then bang, the lights went out. There's cars stalled and out there, and I'll let Debray tell his story. He's going to tell it to I think a couple of the panels here today. But anyway, so there's a living survivor who went through this, who's still having health problems. These are documented. I've seen some of the medical records. We've talked to his people who are taking care of him, and we know quite a bit about these three gentlemen who were all in the car together. And it's not a pretty picture. So if you think about long COVID, you could say these people have long CO2 exposure symptoms. They are the long haulers of this particular incident, and they would continue to be people like this if there were other releases that affected communities. So this is the thing. You have a first of its kind incident. World Health Organization confirmed to us that there had never been a massive release of CO2 from anthropogenic CO2, meaning CO2 that was being handled by human beings and moved through a pipeline. This is the first time it happened. And yet we're plunging ahead with a program to build who knows how many miles of these things. We're plunging ahead in Iowa, in Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Illinois are all involved with these three massive pipelines that will be ethanol pipelines. It's caused a huge sort of social upheaval in the states that are affected and the counties that are affected, with people who are just not willing to allow this to happen. How will they stop it? I don't know. But the combination of taking people's land who are farmers and can't just pick up and relocate, and the now better publicized safety risks, I have to wrap it up here, has resulted in the situation we have today. Anyway, I could easily talk for another 10 hours, which would really be an unfortunate thing for everyone here, probably. But I wanted to say that I really appreciate Bill Karam and Amanda and Aaron Murphy and all the other folks who put this together, all the people who were here, whether from industry, government, or we have a lot of work to do, folks. That's all I have to say. And I hope you'll hear what Debray has to say at one of the panels. We can try and figure out exactly where he's going to be today and get that information out to people. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what happened in Satartia.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Dan. We just so appreciate you being here. Like we've said so many times, but it can never be said enough. I don't think we would be talking about this without you, so thank you. So now we're gonna move into kind of the panel discussion topic. I will sort of briefly introduce our panelists and then give you guys each a chance to give yourself a little bit of a deeper introduction and how you individually are working on CO2 pipeline safety. So we'll start with John Stoody of the Liquid Energy Pipelines Association, if you want to start.
Hi, thanks. My name's John Stoody, and pleasure to be here. Several conferences so far, and really enjoy coming to share what industry is doing on pipelines. I lead our organization's safety program efforts, and we work across the industry on practices we heard before, recommendations, standards, how to operate pipelines more safely, and how to make sure incidents like this don't happen again. I think I'll start with the conclusion, or do you want us to give our 2 minutes now, or just we doing introductions?
Yeah, 2 minutes of kind of what you're working on.
I'll start at the end, which is what I want everyone to walk out of this room thinking. And that's the main question is, will Satartia bring positive change? And the answer is yes. So a few points on that specifics. Industry recognizes the need to improve CO2 pipeline safety. One of the things that we did, is, and there's been mention, is the trust put out a report with safety recommendations. And one of my roles leading our safety programs, we have a CO2 pipeline safety group. We actually went through every single one of those recommendations. And we thought about them when we looked at the regulations and we looked at our operations. And we agree with the need to do most of those regulations. We don't agree with all of them, I'll just be honest up front. But more than the majority we agree with. So that brings me to the second point, which is we are and will take action to improve pipeline safety, CO2 pipeline operation, construction, and emergency response. And we have work groups underway. We can talk more about that later, especially on how best to respond to the unique needs of a CO2 pipeline. And then third is our role as a national trade association is to bring the national perspective on pipelines. And there are about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines across the U.S. They've actually been operating for over 40 years, mostly out west, this one in Pennsylvania. And when you look at the incident safety data on PHMSA, publicly available PHMSA incident database, the overall national record of CO2 pipelines is positive. And they are actually one of the safest pipeline systems when you compare them to crude oil or refined products. So that's what the data says. Now, going back to the beginning, do we need to do better? Yes, and we'll talk about how and what are the specific actions we'll be taking and working with partners on to try and make CO2 pipelines safer.
Thanks. Next, we have Max Kieba. He's from PHMSA, and I just want to take an opportunity to recognize PHMSA announcing their future rulemaking on CO2, updating the CO2 pipeline safety regulations. I think that that's really important to recognize that PHMSA took that proactive approach, although there may be some restraints and hurdles to jump over in that process. It's really great to see. And yeah, Max, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Max Kieba, is this on yet? Max Kieba with PHMSA. Currently program development. The best way I can describe my division currently is kind of the nexus of policy, data, and technical, which can be a very dangerous but also fun place to be in the agency, but a longtime engineer. And I will say I'm an extension of probably about 12 to 15 roughly informal team members. PHMSA's got a big team culture. And we've got folks in regs looking at these issues, legal, our regional folks. As an extension, we have some state folks that are here, but also looking at it as well from different angles as well. So I'm one person, but again, I represent a team of many great individuals. A lot of new folks looking at from different angles. Do we need to be a new look at this as well? So mostly on the technical and the PHMSA side, I'll talk in some of the questions about our statutory authorities, what regulatory authorities we currently have, and other ways we lean forward of, again, our mission is safety, so how we focus on safety first. So.
All right, thank you, Max. And then finally, we have Paul Blackburn with Bold Alliance.
Thanks, Amanda. And yeah, my name is Paul Blackburn. I'm an attorney. I work for the Bold Alliance. And, it's really great to be back in this conference. I used to be a board member of the Pipeline Safety Trust. I don't know how many of you know who I am. I did the initial strategic targeting for Keystone and Keystone XL. I was involved in Sandpiper. You probably remember that went down. I have been involved in Line 3, DAPL, and quite a number of other pipelines, and been counsel in quite a number of regulatory proceedings. So what is my job? In some ways, it's very simple. My job is to find lack of integrity and highlight it. That's really what I do. Now, there's lots of different kinds of lack of integrity. There's a lack of integrity in the Pipeline Safety Act itself. There's a lack of integrity in the Inflation Reduction Act, that's for sure. There's a lack of integrity within the regulations. There's a lack of integrity within the implementation and enforcement. There's many kinds of lack of integrity, and there's also probably the most important integrity in all of all of these is the personal integrity of people who are working in the field. Without that, nothing else really matters. And I just want to say that, I recognize that there are people with tremendous integrity whose, jobs are there to protect thousands and thousands of people, and they do their jobs extremely well. And I deeply respect their efforts. At the same time, there's also a significant lack of integrity with regard to a lot of engagement with the public. And with regard to CO2 pipelines, this is going to be a new experience for all of you that are involved in this. I mean, I've been working on this for over a decade, and the level of public interest intensity is just an order of magnitude different, at least. So, as we go into this, realize, and these aren't necessarily, this is not the green community either, at least in the Midwest. This is landowners, so they're treating this extremely differently. We even have farm bureaus being opposed to some of these pipelines. That is just earth-shattering in a political sense. So, this is going to be a new experience for everybody, and some people are here to we're all here to try to be productive together. At the same time, you realize that there is a stick, and that stick is out there. Now, with regard to, for example, the airline industry, I think the reason that is there's so much safety there is it's so public. And the airline industry has to be aware of the risks, and people are very aware when those big planes go over and they come down. Pipelines are hidden. And that means that, the industry sometimes likes to keep it hidden. And then when things go bad, the difference between how people are feeling about the pipeline industry and there's often a lack of, I think, responding appropriately to the bad things that do happen. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. All right, so we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we'll try and keep these answers short and concise while still diving into the topic. But I was hoping, Max, that you could start us off with sort of describing the current state of existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure.
Yeah, so currently, based on our data, at least as of last night, we have about approximately 5,300 miles of CO2 pipelines out there, roughly 8 to 20 inches in diameter. Most of these historically done for enhanced oil recovery, so kind of the different aspect of some of these projects we're seeing now that are looking at certainly carbon capture, supporting ethanol plants, biofuels. I don't have pressures on these, but most of them, if anyone doesn't know, you might hear in the regulations talking about supercritical CO2. So basically that has to be above roughly 87.8 to 88 Fahrenheit, and then also above about 1070 PSI. So most of these are going to be running between 1,000 and 2,000 PSI temperature-wise. Again, if they're in supercritical. I have heard some of these newer projects, there might be portions that might be below one of those points from a temperature aspect. So, but again, and most of them, the enhanced oil right now are in North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas. Actually, not too terribly far away from Louisiana that gets into the one that went through Tarsha. The newer projects are in some new areas, so Iowa, South Dakota, Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota, North Dakota is also in there as well. So I think in general, it's a lot of folks learning about these, both us on this new approach to CO2, but also certainly out in the public as well. So.
Great, thanks, Max.
Yep.
Paul, on to you, hoping that somewhat briefly, you can describe the safety risks and regulatory gaps of these pipelines that we kind of alluded to earlier.
Sure, and I think that first off, to start with, I think most of you have seen the Pipeline Safety Trust paper that Richard Kuprowitz authored, on the different kinds of issues that are outstanding. And we could go into a lot of detail on all those issues. I think that to start with, there's jurisdictional issues. Which pipelines are covered. These pipelines, we know the operating temperatures have been released in some of the PSC, some of the applications to the regulators. And many of them are going to be operating, at least for parts of them, below supercritical, the critical point, the critical temperature. But there's also questions about, where's the jurisdictional boundary on the on the sequestration side or the enhanced oil recovery side? Enhanced oil recovery is a bit clear, but on the sequestration side, where does PHMSA's jurisdiction end? There's issues like the odorants. There's issues of, like, one of the things that citizens are extremely concerned about is what's the danger zone? What's the zone of hazard around this? If you look at Satartia, the rupture was 1 mile as the crow flies from downtown Satartia, or the center of Satartia is not really downtown. But if you look at the way the CO2 must have flowed through the topography, it's more like 1.3 miles. Well, that was a 9.5 miles of pipeline release, a 24-inch pipeline. The regulations right now are 15 NHCAs and 20 miles in other places. So you could be looking at double the release in different locations. Well, what's the danger zone? We don't have regulations on that. And can it be estimated? Yes, but probably more on the basis of computational fluid dynamic modeling, because it's going to be heavily dependent on topography and weather and other conditions. And there's a great deal of concern and questions about this. We've heard first responders say, I'm not going to go into this clouds. I'm not going to go respond because I don't know anything about this risk. That's a problem, but it's also legitimate. In the same time, we've got the companies who are proposing these refusing to disclose their models. They may not have even done any modeling yet. But why is that? Well, they say that's because they don't have to do the models because PHMSA doesn't require it, at least not until the emergency response plans are done, after the pipeline starts operations. Well, why not why not provide the models now? Why not develop a regulatory structure that can actually estimate the danger zone in a reasonable way around these pipelines? It's a great, people want to know that. They want to know it. We've got issues with a lot of misunderstanding about the industry saying that local states and governments don't have control over routing, that they can't consider safety in routing, which is, we've got 4 federal cases right now on preemption issues. We'll talk about that later. But that basic question of what is the danger zone, and can anybody keep a pipeline away from high consequence facilities? And there again, the high consequence liquid pipeline high consequence areas are all defined primarily for the purpose of oil, not for the purpose of CO2. Most of the factors for high consequence areas don't apply to CO2 pipelines. So we don't really have any guidance or regulation on what should be considered a high consequence area. And just to sort of wrap this up, one of the things about airlines is airplanes, when they go down, it tends to be a mass casualty incident. Pretty much everybody dies. Generally speaking, there haven't been that many of those for oil and natural gas. But with CO2, there's the potential for there to be mass casualty incidents. The CO2 pipeline is going to go in new kinds of areas, from emitters to sequestration to hubs to sequestration areas, enhanced oil recovery. They're going to be going through much more densely populated areas. So, the urgent need for understanding what high consequence is and to figure out how to route these around high consequence areas such as nursing homes and schools and hospitals. How do we do that? And how do we make sure that the public knows that they're going to be kept safe from these pipelines? So we'll leave it there.
Thanks, Paul. And did want to point out that in addition to the report we have online, we also have sort of a media backgrounder that summarizes it, as well as a document called Regulatory and Knowledge Gaps that sort of summarizes all of those. So those can be found on our website. I'd like to open it up to everyone for this question, but maybe starting with Max, just really talking about how does the potential build out of these CO2 pipelines interface with the regulatory shortfalls, given that PHMSA has announced a rulemaking to update these regulations?
So first, my lawyers will say I can't tell you anything that's in the rule. We have ex parte requirements, so I can't tell you what's actually in the rule, but I think it's fair to say what we put out publicly. In addition to the information of the rulemaking, emergency preparedness was a big miss on this, knowing what was there, the public engagement piece of it. And I think we've said publicly we're at least looking there for sure. We've also launched a bunch of our R&D projects. There's at least 3 ongoing right now. One is looking at PIR, potential impact radius for CO2. There's others looking at aspects like welding and some of those aspects. So that's also some R&D we have in place now that's ongoing. We also put out the failure investigation report if you haven't seen it. And I will say we are encouraging as much as possible others to look at that so we can all learn about it. Getting away from the old culture of, okay, something just happened with that particular operator incident, it can't possibly happen to us, versus, yes, this is an industry issue, and yes, it is partly a regulatory issue looking at it. In the meantime, I will say also, I'll touch on our statutory authority. So we do have statutory authority for CO2 pipelines. That includes gaseous, liquid, and supercritical. We only have currently regulatory authority for the supercritical I talked about. So our statutory authority, where they're talking gaseous, even some of these pipelines that are talking about playing the games with the not playing the games, but there might be operational considerations for temperatures, we still have the authority to investigate any safety issues that may come up if these pipelines happen. So while it does take a long time for regulations to happen, but we still have some, again, statutory authorities that we can implement. So hopefully that gives a little high level. I will say I talked about states. So one challenge PHMSA has is we don't have siting authority of any kind. So we can't say whether a pipeline happens or not. If it happens, it's got to be done safely. We will certainly do technical support. If a siting authority asks us to give input, we will. A lot of these are being handled at the state and local issues at a county level. But I will say our states, even if they don't have liquid authority under our certifications, if anyone doesn't know, states have authorities. Most states have authority for gas pipelines. There's a smaller list of liquid authority on pipelines. But I will say even states that don't have authority, South Dakota is one of them, that they are learning more about CO2. They are getting engaged in some of these reviews at a state and local level. So they're getting involved, even though, again, they don't have the authority per se, they are still getting involved at that level. So again, as an extension of PHMSA, I like to say we have 600 inspectors. That's 200 roughly PHMSA. We have about 400 state inspectors. So there are some of our state folks that are looking at it as well. So again, while we're waiting around for these semantics, I agree there are some unique risks we have to look at, but definitions, things like that, we do still have authorities that we can put into place to make sure things are done safely.
Thanks for that. I think it's also just important, putting on my PST hat here, to point out the statutory limitations that PHMSA is under. You know, the legacy clause that, you know, you can't put, once a pipeline is in the ground, new regulations won't, you know, might not apply to that. And then also the unique cost benefit analysis that PHMSA is under. So just as Max said, regulations take a long time, and there are also a lot of difficult hurdles and hoops to jump through. So yeah, Paul?
You know, years ago I was in a hearing at a county level, and we had a lot of people there. And the county commissioner looked at it and said, you know, sometimes we do this easy and sometimes we do this right. This time we're going to do it right. You know, and I think that that's the situation here, where the amount of interest and intensity around these pipelines is going to require that the industry really do this right. You know, one of the lack of integrities within the regulations is that when, you know, back in, was it 1991, when CO2 pipelines are first regulated, you know, PHMSA and the industry, an API recommendation, just simply added the words and carbon dioxide everywhere in the oil and gas pipe, the oil pipeline regulations that has liquid pipeline regulations. You know, and there were some rational reasons for that, but now we're talking about build out, you know, the conservative numbers, I think, from places like Princeton and the Great Plains Institute are like 60,000 miles of new pipelines. But if you look at those maps, they're all assuming centralized planning with a rational structure, you know, which is just not happening. These pipelines are being developed commercially, and so they're overlapping. They're going to be, you know, crisscrossing each other like crazy if they all get built out. We'd be talking, you know, many more miles than 60 or 70,000 miles of pipe. Further, unlike the oil and gas industry, which grew organically, you know, this entire industry is based on federal tax credits, you know, and that means that it's being driven extremely quickly. The Inflation Reduction Act was so phenomenally generous to the point of being, I think, theft of public dollars, that it's just going to drive this industry much faster than the oil and gas industry ever been driven to expand. And we know, the engineering things, quick, fast, or cheap, or sorry, cheap, good, or fast, and pick two. There's going to be a lot of pressure to make these pipelines quickly and to bring this industry into place quickly. It's going to be a very different regulatory and development environment than anything that's ever happened in the pipeline industry before.
Thanks, Paul. John?
Thanks. We've talked a little bit about some of the gaps, and I'll hit on them too. And that was a great service the trust did to highlight those. But I wanted to talk about, and people are probably asking, what are the regulations that are covering CO2 pipelines? And what do they cover? Are there a few? Are there a lot? And I made a list of, and I'll go through quickly. You look in the regulations, the jargon is 49 CFR 195, but there are different parts, and they're in categories that you might imagine. Design requirements for internal design pressure, fracture propagation, that's if there's a crack in the steel, installation of new pipe, leak detection systems. There are construction requirements, they call those subpart D, for material inspection, pipeline location, welds and testing, cover over buried pipe, regulations on clearance between pipeline and underground structures, regulations on the location of valves. PHMSA regulates CO2 pipelines for pressure testing, what test pressures you have to use. They require operations and maintenance regulations, procedural manuals for operations, emergency response training, maximum operating pressure, regulations on reliable communications, regulations on inspecting in the right-of-way. PHMSA regulates extreme weather events, inspections after those, leak detection systems, and then integrity management, the inspection and maintenance of pipelines. So there is a lot. There are many, many, many requirements on the books now. So the next question, well, is it enough? And the answer is no. There are gaps, and we've talked about a handful of those. And we agree that we need to update the definition of CO2 pipelines in PHMSA regs to extend to gas. We agree we need more both to study the modeling and then get them into operator plans on the impact areas and the unique nature of CO2 pipelines, how it follows the topography, and it's very conditional on weather, atmospheric conditions. Fracture propagation, there is existing a specific regulation in the PHMSA code on consideration of fracture propagation when it's under construction, but then not under operation. So we'd be supportive of adding something there. Odorant is an issue. We talked about the smell. That's a technical issue. You know how natural gas smells like rotten eggs when you smell it in the house? Well, that chemical won't work for CO2. And so they need to find a different one. And the engineers are working on that now. And then we definitely agree on increasing coordination with local emergency responders. And to that, I'll just finish with what are some of the actions that we're doing now? Because one dynamic we face, and it's not unique to PHMSA, across the federal government, it takes years to put new regulations into place. There's a process, notice to the public, receiving comment from the public, making changes to those. And so industry is not waiting. We're not sitting back. We are now working on recommended practices, the best practices for operators on emergency response, how to do that type of modeling, how to incorporate that type of modeling into your emergency response plans, how to reach out to your local first responders, which they already do generally for pipelines, but specific to CO2. And then how can we help first responders to know how to respond in an incident? Industry currently funds online free training for local first responders. Any first responder in your communities can go online and receive that training for free on how to respond to a pipeline incident. And we plan to add how to respond to a CO2 pipeline incident in the future to provide that resource for free for first responders. So there's a lot going on. I'm glad you chose CO2 pipelines because it's an important area where there's a lot that's getting better, and we'll look forward to the trust's work in this area.
Great, thank you. All right, I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions because I'm sure that there are a good amount of questions. But kind of just wanted to think about what's the path forward? What does the path forward look like? And I'm glad you kind of talked about what the industry is thinking about on the path forward. But Max specifically was wondering if you can talk about some of the complexities that PHMSA will have to address and navigate with the future expanded regulation.
I have to be careful here. So when you say regulation, again, ex parte, I can't say what we're putting in the rulemaking. But I will say for the project reviews, we are definitely look at some of these aspects. Plume modeling was mentioned as an example. So certainly the high consequence area applications in these project reviews, we look at how they do their analysis. And I think it was mentioned, most of CO2 right now is in Part 195, but when it gets released, it turns into a gas. So what we're trying to lean folks on is, use hazardous liquid integrity management on the liquid side, but also when it's released, consider the aspects certainly of gas integrity management, people, dwellings, things like that, valve closure times. And by the way, we just recently issued a valve rule that does apply to CO2 as well. So while we have a number of rulemakings that are in play, that while we're waiting for the overall CO2, we have others that we are making sure these operators look at. Public engagement to me is a big piece. It was mentioned earlier. Respect was mentioned earlier, and that's one of my personal core values. And that's what gets me disappointed is when I find out the operators talk a good game about notifying the public. Public awareness was brought up. Some people try to point out that technically it's in our operations and maintenance portion of the code, so it may not necessarily apply to construction. But if the first time the public and the first responders are finding out about a pipeline is when there's an incident, that's way too late. So as much as possible, engage with the public at the siting side. And again, we don't have siting authority, but as much as possible on the siting side, the construction side, actively listening, which we don't always do all the time, just finding out what the concerns are, what you want to learn about for CO2. That's what we try to encourage operators to do. The public engagement RP was talked about as could be a good thing, but it might take a while. So while we're waiting for that, again, engagement piece is a big part. Looking at some of the other aspects, a lot of R&D is ongoing. I mentioned some of them, but things like purity of even supercritical state, a lot of concerns come up with the purity of whether it's the 90%, which is in our definition, but sometimes if there's water content that comes in, things like that, the materials have to be compatible. And I think our aspect, and it was mentioned too, with the shift from these enhanced oil recovery that were in certain areas, but now you're hearing about these CO2 hubs that are going to be talked about with much more expansive, and I agree with I've seen numbers too on the order of, so we're going from 5,300 to potentially 60 to 100,000 miles that some believe it needs to happen to get to this net zero or on our path towards net zero. So again, you're talking much more infrastructure, much more mileage, much more complex operations. So you're hearing some of these that they may not just be in supercritical, they may be gas portions, they may be liquid portions and others. So some of those are coming up in project reviews as well. So because those are some of our actions. And we will be serious when there's incidents that happen. I mean, Satarsha, you might see numbers out there that there were no injuries. Injuries by certain definitions are if they required overnight hospitalizations, but there were a number of people evacuated in this incident. At least 45 individuals went to the hospital, and then we're hearing long-term effects as well. So I think there's acknowledgement this could have been a heck of a lot worse. So hopefully you've seen our leadership will take action if we need to. We did a press release in May. We put a pretty darn hefty fine, I should say proposed fine, because there is a process where the operator can still have a hearing to talk about that. But so we will lean forward again if there are issues. We're trying to learn about it as much as possible. So hopefully that kind of answers a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're going to open it up for questions from the audience so we can get as many of those as possible. So if we have our mics running around. Yeah, come back up.
This is a question for Max. Chuck Lesniak from Texas. Given what Paul's talking about, what you all are talking about with the rapid expansion of these CO2 pipelines around the country, this sounds to me like either one or two things need to happen. is one, a moratorium on new pipelines, CO2 pipelines, or an emergency rulemaking, because it's clear that the rules are inadequate. And so what authority in either of those areas does either PHMSA or the Secretary have, or the White House have to do either one of those things? Because something needs to happen. We're not prepared for this, clearly, and this is coming fast.
That leans heavily into policy. I see Alan in the back. The moratorium on pipelines can get more problematic, I believe. And Alan, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I will say there are thoughts of, do we need to accelerate that rule? At least the NPRM that is scheduled, I believe, currently 2024, where I believe there are talks about seeing if we can move it up with a bunch of other high priority rulemakings we have. So, Alan, do you mind talking anything about the policy questions?
Yeah, this is Alan. Related to the siting issue, that our focus is, I think Max had indicated earlier, it is pipeline safety, but to the pipeline safety policy side, I can assure you we're taking a hard look at CO2 regulations, and we're going to go where we need to go to address the gaps, because we recognize there are some. The matter of when that occurs, I think we can look at as we go forward, but we realize, and it's high on our priority to address. But as you know, these things take time because of the process we have.
Is there an emergency rulemaking authority?
Well, there are different tools we have, such as direct final rule, interim final rule, or the standard notice and comment. But we'll take a look at all those, see where we need to go.
Yeah, and I'll say in terms of there's already been a proposal for moratorium, and we understand that PHMSA has limited jurisdiction that way, but counties and states don't. We have a number of moratoria proposed in South Dakota. Other counties are considering moratoria, because they see the lack of adequate regulations, and their citizens are just simply concerned about that. So they're calling for moratorium, and certainly counties, we believe, can do that, as can states. So this may not be a matter of if, but when and where. And that is a very rational response to a situation where there's simply a lack of regulation for some of these pipelines, and particularly, like, for example, the gaseous CO2 pipelines. We're also seeing, for example, emergency response folks developing their own impact zone rules right now. They're figuring out their own back of the envelope models. Some of them are more sophisticated. Some of them are looking at scientific papers. But the industry is potentially facing, a raft of, and this is not something that, Bold is pushing for these models. These folks are looking at this situation, seeing the risk, and developing their own responses to it. And to the extent that starts becoming diversified all over the country, the industry could be faced with multiple standards and multiple jurisdictions all over the country. So there's a very, I think, a big incentive to figure this stuff out with plume dispersion modeling. It's going to come. It's not a question of when. It's going to be developed. And the question is how chaotically it's developed. So just to be aware that there is a great deal of citizen involvement and concern about this. One of the things that Dan didn't touch on as much is the first responder response to the experiences with the Satartia rupture. With truly heroic sheriff driving into the plume and pulling people out at his own personal great risk. The fire department not knowing what they were going into at all. And so when you talk about training, it ain't enough, folks. Training is not enough. In most rural areas in the Midwest, these are volunteer fire departments. They don't necessarily have the equipment that would be required to respond to these kind of ruptures. It's going to take money. It's going to take resources to respond, for them to gear up to be able to handle this response. And so who's going to pay for it?
All right, thanks, Paul. Next question over here.
Travis Hallam. I was the CO2 pipeline emergency response coordinator and trainer. So we'd go to all these communities, get them trained up, explain to them how to respond. But one of the recommendations I say you should use is, Jessica pointed on earlier, not all pipelines are driven the same. Some are monetarily driven, some are safety driven. I was fortunate enough to work with Dakota Gas, extremely safety driven. We didn't meet the PHMSA rules. That's baseline. We went far beyond that. So we had a reverse 911 system to notify everybody along that corridor. We trained all the response groups along that 205-mile corridor. They've already set the standard. All you've got to do is look at what some of those groups are doing that are out front and make that the standard. Don't create a minimum that's a baseline. Bring something up that's responsible and proven to work correctly. And as far as the hydrology, we see that too often, where these groups are just trenching. Make them do the HDD boring in areas of, difficult terrain. It's not as difficult as what's being made here. We have groups that are safety driven, follow that path, and make that the standard.
And I believe you're talking about the Source Valley Pipeline.
Dakota Gasification Pipeline, that
Yeah.
goes from Beulah up into Estevan.
Yeah, I mean, for example, one of the lack of integrities. Well, Summit is arguing, and the industry is arguing in Iowa right now that they can't disclose their emergency response plans because this is considered secret. Yet, they filed emergency response plans in North Dakota and Minnesota, and you can get the Source Valley emergency response plans online, probably because Canada requires them to be disclosed. But, so we've got the industry saying one thing in one state and other things in other states, and the citizens look at all this and say, this is just baloney.
It is baloney because we did it. We were out front with ours. We'd have public meetings. We did it, and this wasn't recent. This is well over 20-some years ago,
Right.
And it's sort of the model I've used for the success within our boundaries is build it the right way, hold them accountable to being safety-driven, not monetarily driven. And it's not as difficult. Take a successful operator and use their model.
All right, I think we have time for one more, but I'll preface a short one. So whoever's going to answer it, try and keep it concise. I do encourage you to try and find any of our speakers, presenters afterwards, and try and get more answers to your questions. But let's do in the back there.
Hi, my name's Jane Klebb. I started the group Bold Nebraska. We first took on Keystone XL and have helped other communities stop pipelines in their communities. We've now branched out to the Bold Alliance. Paul works with us. We're specifically working with farmers and ranchers with easement action teams in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and soon other states as well. There's just so much misinformation that the carbon pipeline companies are giving to states and counties and landowners. And it is really an area where I'm specifically looking at you, Max, where we need PHMSA to step in. You have I've sit through these hearings. I go to county board meetings. This is personal, firsthand knowledge. Carbon pipeline companies are telling county commissioners as they're trying to create rules, because they don't have any rules on the books for carbon pipelines. In Nebraska, we don't even have a state routing rule that applies to carbon pipelines. When we did a routing rule for Keystone XL, it only applies to oil pipelines. So we're being asked to potentially take 4 maximum pressure carbon pipelines in our state without any state or county regulations. That is terrifying for landowners who have this land in their family for over 100 years, and tribes, including the Winnebago tribe. All the tribes in Nebraska have passed a resolution against these pipelines. So we need PHMSA to be very clear and very specific about what states and counties can and cannot do, because the carbon pipeline companies are coming in and telling them they can't do anything, that it's all federally preempted because of safety. And we've been down this road before. They're telling counties that it's no different than when you open up a can of soda water and you get that tingling feeling on your tongue. That's what would happen if an explosion happens. That's what they're telling counties in formal proceedings. So you may pretend up there that there's a long list of things that carbon pipeline companies have to abide by, but that's not what we're facing on the ground. And I do think that a moratorium should be put in place until these regulations in counties and states are prepared to deal with them. And if the governments aren't going to step in, then the citizens will. We have lots of lawyers. We can raise lots of money. We will tie you up in court for a long time.
Max, do you want to touch on that very briefly? and then
Yeah,
we'll wrap
well, I
up?
would just say I hear some interesting things about misinformation out there as well. So I will say if someone's trying to speak for PHMSA and it's not PHMSA, I would say come to one of us and say, hey, we're hearing this. Early on, me and some of my legal folks, Iowa Office of Consumer Advocate reached out to us early in the process. We have community liaisons, a bunch are here. Feel free to reach out to them as well because, yeah, when I hear that too, that PHMSA said this and there's no PHMSA individual in the chain, please do come to us. We're limited on how far we can jump into their process, but if it's something you want to get clarification on information, please reach out to us. Me personally, feel free. Again, we have community liaisons that are all looking at this as well. And we'll try to, as much as we can, figure out what is at least the true facts behind what they're saying or not saying. So at least I think we can commit to that. We just jumping into the processes we may not be able to, but hopefully that helps a little bit. So
I wish that we could take more questions. Yeah.
thing I need to respond to. Can I-
Go ahead, Dan. Yeah, very
Is
quickly.
Hello? How about now? Okay. Just a couple of things. One was, I totally agree with Jane, who I've been to a lot of those meetings. I've spent some time, quite a bit of time recently in Iowa and other places out there. What's happening on the ground is it's an absolute propaganda fest. It really is. Facts have been altered, about all sorts of things historically that happened, like Sartarsha. Other things are overvalued, like the record of 5,000 miles of pipeline indicating much of anything. I mean, that's a very small amount of pipelines compared to the petroleum system. And as Paul mentioned, they're in places where there are no high consequence areas, pretty much. The other thing I was wanted to say, just to correct the record, and pardon me if it seems petty, but I have to respond to Max here. There were overnight hospitalizations. Denbury admitted that in their 48-hour report to the NRC. They later tried to walk that back and say there may have been one and it was unrelated, but that's not true. And we have the facts on that. If PHMSA is interested in seeing more on that, we'll dig it out. But I've been hearing that way too much. It's not true. People spent time in the hospital. Some of them are there for over a week. That has to be pushed back against because that really trivializes what happened. Thanks.
There we go. All right, so thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate it, and I know we didn't cover probably everything that everyone wanted, but like I said, find the panelists afterwards, and hopefully they can have some more answers for you. So thank you, everyone. On to the next panel.